Well, thank you, friends, for this extremely kind invitation to join you today. This is my first appearance at the SMMT Summit. I don't know if I can claim I'm headlining it as the final speaker, but I imagine you get quite a few MPs turning up at this event and starting off by telling you how much they themselves love the automotive sector. Well, I intend to be no different, because for me, growing up in the Northeast in a working class family, cars in particular were never just a form of transport. Public transport in County Durham in the 90s wasn't great. Owning a car or having a friend who did was transformative. And cars for me are about that freedom, but also aspiration, and crucially, they're about skilled, well-paid jobs. Many of my school friends went to work in the automotive industry and still do. Now, I'll confess, having now grown up to have 4 children and 2 dogs, I don't always get to drive the kind of car I imagined as a younger man. But that sense of freedom and aspiration still holds true. So when we look to the future of this industry and the challenges ahead, we've got to remember what cars mean to people, because future policy, especially on decarbonisation, will only succeed if it takes this on board. What I want to talk to you about today is the bright future I see for the whole automotive industry, the partner I think the industry needs in government, and why I believe that's essential to turning around the wider performance of the UK economy as a whole. Because nothing demonstrates better the challenges, but also the opportunities that our economy faces, like the automotive industry. There's an urgent need to decarbonise and a hugely ambitious timescale set to deliver that. Commodity prices and inflation are impacting not just production, but demand. Supply chains and access to technologies like semiconductors are under real strain, and the post-Brexit changes to rules of origin represent substantial further challenges. Like many rivals and competitors across the world, we've got to fight to attract investment and secure the next generation of models are built here. And it's clear to me, particularly when it comes to battery capacity, that your industry cannot overcome these challenges alone. It needs a partner in government. And with all due humility, I believe the Labour Party and myself are the people best placed to be that partner. Because if we are to achieve our net zero target, it is self-evident we have to develop, build and sell more electric vehicles. And we surely need to retain the skilled jobs and the export success stories that come from a strong automotive sector. So it's fundamental that we create a domestic battery supply chain with sufficient capacity for us to remain a powerhouse in vehicle production. But I read the same studies and reports as all of you. To support the battery production that is needed requires us to build around 10 gigafactories. That means 5 up and running by 2030, but that is not the position we're in. And I am worried we could miss out. Our analysis shows we could be creating 5,000 jobs a year in electric cars alone. But right now, we're only creating around 1,000 jobs a year. Now, I've been able to speak to many of you over the last 6 months, and I know you are doing and planning some impressive things. But I think we do need more ambition from government. So this is what I would intend to do under the next Labour government. Firstly, we'll back automotive manufacturers and create jobs by part financing the creation of 3 new additional gigafactories by 2025. We'll use funding from the Climate Investment Pledge that Rachel Reeves announced last year to do this, and it will be fundamental to ensuring Britain's global leadership in the electric vehicle market. Secondly, we'll make electric vehicle ownership more affordable by offering interest-free loans for new and used electric vehicles to those on low to middle incomes to remove some of the upfront cost barrier. Thirdly, we'll make it easier for people to drive an electric vehicle wherever they live by accelerating the rollout of charging points on streets. Now, that is what I believe real partnership looks like, with government taking the long-term view and leveraging in the private investment required to secure good jobs and deliver net zero. And the approach we're proposing on electric vehicles is exactly the approach we want to take to the economy as a whole. A partnership that harnesses the dynamism of the market economy, but recognises that without an active state creating new markets and opportunities, we do risk missing out to our competitors. I am in a tremendously fortunate position in that I have pretty much a free rein to visit any business in this country. And I know how good we can be. I was in Coventry yesterday at the London Electric Vehicle Company and the Battery Industrialisation Centre, and it was brilliant. And we do have some world-class firms, and the best of British industry is as good, if not better, I believe, than anything in the world. And a lot of that is in the automotive sector. But what keeps me up at night is how, knowing how good we can be, why do we face that projection of having the second lowest growth in the G20 next year, second only to Russia? Why has growth and productivity growth over the last decade been so poor? Why are taxes at record levels even though you'll struggle to get a passport or see a dentist? What we need is a plan to turn that round. And with respect to the Chancellor, I know you had him on this morning, bringing back imperial measurements or grammar schools or threatening a trade war with the European Union is not the way to do it. I believe that central to our relatively poor economic performance is our poor record on business investment. The fact we have the lowest rate of private investment in the G7 is absolutely what we need to change. And to deliver net zero, it's even more important. And that's the rationale for Labour's climate investment pledge, bringing UK public investment to comparable levels to our competitors in order to de-risk and leverage in the private investment we need. We also plan to scrap business rates and replace them with a fairer and more modern system, and to create a modern industrial strategy to provide confidence and consistency for businesses over successive investment cycles. Now I know, many of you will have seen quite a few government plans and strategies come and go. The last industrial strategy lasted only 2 years, so I would be quite sceptical too. So we plan to learn the lessons of the past and embed that industrial strategy into the UK's architecture, with a reformed Industrial Strategy Council set up on a statutory basis, playing a role comparable to the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee or the Committee on Climate Change. And that industrial strategy will cover all parts of the economy, but it will recognise that what a sector like the automotive industry requires is different to hospitality or retail. Decarbonisation must be an essential part of that industrial strategy, but we should be frank and transparent on what that requires, including publishing the UK's emissions on a consumption as well as a geographic basis, to ensure that essential parts of your supply chain, especially the steel industry, have a strong future here in the UK. On Brexit, I know that leaving the single market has added to the burdens you're facing. But I honestly believe that plunging this country into another impasse where we relive the Brexit debate over and over again would create the kind of uncertainty and instability that in itself then becomes the problem. And frankly, that could never end. So our policy is for trade solutions, not constitutional ones. We'll get an agreement on veterinary standards, we'll seek mutual recognition of conformity assessments, we'll make the deal work far better than it does at present, and we're confident we'll have the more constructive relationship with the EU required to deliver that. In conclusion, I hope what I've told you today has provided some insight, but I also hope some excitement about what our plans might mean for you. And I hope that you recognise our desire to engage with you and develop these plans is genuine and sincere. If I was asked to sum up British politics over the last few years from a business perspective, I would say Labour have changed, but so too have the Conservatives, and the change in Labour is certainly for the better. When I'm at one of your factories, I'm always struck by how the workforce, the unions, and the management all say the same thing. You want real, long-term commitment to this sector. And I get it. And by the way, I think the way the industry and the unions work together to campaign for that long-term future is exemplary. When I was speaking to the London Electric Vehicle Company in Coventry yesterday, it was just a pleasure to visit that business and see the pride and the ambition of both the management and the workforce, and also the huge potential for further expansion. Firms like that should have a government that shares that ambition rather than stoking division for their own ends. What I care about is how do we secure and attract the investment we need for the future? How do we harness the opportunities net zero will bring? How do we make the reforms that we need to get to where we need to be? These are the questions that matter. And I look forward to working with you as we deliver the answers to them and ensure that the future for this industry is as bright as it possibly could be. Thank you again, friends, for the chance to come and talk to you today.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Jonathan's kindly agreed to take some questions, so if there's any questions from the audience, I've realised how difficult it is to see the audience, but there is at least one or two over there, side by side.
Thank you very much for the speech, and you'll have a double pack of diversity here in the conference. Also, thank you for mentioning the electrification, but today we discussed lots of geopolitics problems need to be considered from the politics, such as, you know, through the Ukraine crisis, we have energy problems. Obviously, there is a need of diversity of energy policy, which is lacking at the moment, and that needs to really happen before we talk about electrification or anything else. And secondly is, we are seeing that a lot of protection policies due to the supply chain, like the US is doing reshoring of semiconductors factories, for example, and other components because of the geopolitics currently. And I'm just wondering, where are we at the moment here in the UK as a Labour, MPs? But obviously you talk about it. And thirdly, you know, we're talking about electrification and that you will help support the sales of EVs. We have an inflation crisis of 10%. So how this will be reflected also in your policy? Obviously, people are not thinking about buying cars as they're thinking about buying food. So this is all of the problems I think we need to discuss openly, and they have to be embedded in the policy. So looking forward for your answer.
That's a summary of today's discussion, but yeah.
So thanks for three enormous questions. Well, they're extremely good ones, and let me give you a fair crack at all of them. I mean, first of all, I used to be a shadow energy minister some years ago, and in those times, you'd be familiar with the debate. If you talk about the sort of the trilemma of energy policy, how do you get energy security, affordability, and net zero? And the sort of argument was always you can get two of those things, but not three of those things. I look at the situation that we're in post the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and actually I think in no way are the challenges we face easy, but essentially that trilemma, I would say, is now an easier one to address all three objectives, because clearly by responding to the huge impact in the volatility of fossil fuel prices, you have now a change in how the affordability aspect is looked at, and of course the net zero aspect for the UK is also a concurrent objective of energy security. So I actually think whilst the real-term pressures are extremely difficult, the long-term policy, certainly you shouldn't move away from what we've seen, the relative success story on things like offshore wind in the UK. And actually, for our side, we think responding to a fossil fuel crisis by perhaps making ourselves further dependent on fossil fuels is just an absolute misnomer and the wrong way to go. So I think that side of it is not easy, but it's more straightforward than the first bit of your question, which is how the world is responding. I think not just to Ukraine, but also the pandemic in terms of national resilience and supply chains and a tilt towards protectionism. I mean, the first thing I would say on that is I am absolutely of the view that this country being open to outside innovation, capital, firms and ideas has been tremendously to the strength of the British economy. I mean, like, to give you that example of my childhood when Nissan arrived in the northeast in Sunderland, my hometown, that has clearly been a hugely positive thing for jobs and growth in the economy in that area. So we've got to start with that position. I think you will see, absent of government policy, firms make their own decisions about their supply chains based on the resilience and security of those. I think the public policy bit is a one that perhaps gets us more into what the long-term future is between the West and the more authoritarian or fully authoritarian parts of the world. And I think particularly we have to watch the debate on both sides of the aisle in the US in terms of the resources and the objectives that they are adopting in industrial policy, whether they call it that or not. Usually they call it national resilience, because that could have a direct impact on us. So yes, there's a lot going on. We've got to monitor it, but actually on fundamentally that question of energy security and net zero, I think that's more straightforward for the UK. Your third enormous question was about, I think, the cost of living and whether people are looking at vehicles, they're struggling to buy food. Look, the pressures on households, I've been a Member of Parliament for 12 years, the pressures on households right now are the hardest they've ever been. I think you have to go back a considerable amount of time in British history to find pressures like these. And you know, we're seeing that across a whole range of political issues, and we will continue to do so. But to summarise a very detailed question, I would say, look, why are we in the exact position we're in right now? I think it does come back to a relatively poor decade and a half of economic performance. I think that squeeze on living standards and wages is now felt acutely in things like wage negotiations and you know, people looking at inflation. that it's still rising is evident to that. So I'm not in any way shrinking from those, but I think you've got to go back to the point of what is the long-term objective of economic policy in the UK? And I think for too long there hasn't been a clear one. I think there's been confused priorities, and ultimately that is why I think we are falling behind competitors. And unless we address that, we will never get to relieving these pressures in the short or medium term either.
Thank you. Probably got time for one more quick question. Sophie.
Sophie Ogunby from Toyota. Thank you very much. That was really insightful. There was a really strong focus on battery electric, and it's really important, but there was a real theme this morning around the important need and use for a diverse range of technologies, a broad technology portfolio. I'd be really keen to understand what your position would be around, for example, enabling local authorities with some people call them transition technologies, but other technologies, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, etc. But more importantly, I'm really keen to understand what your position and policy is around hydrogen, supporting hydrogen rollout, hydrogen society, and helping people move into hydrogen-powered vehicles. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. So I was going to mention hydrogen. I was at an event earlier in the week where people said, why do politicians always go on about only hydrogen when they're talking about the future? So I maybe should have put it in and get a reference to it. I think green hydrogen is incredibly exciting, Sophie. I mean, one of the most exciting companies I've been to in the last 6 months would probably be ITM Power in Sheffield, who are a leading world-leading producer of electrolyzers. Now, I think what's so interesting about the different things, when I talk about that partnership required with government, clearly the fundamental thing that's required around green hydrogen is a regulatory change around the price that electricity can be purchased from the grid when wind farms currently go price negative and we turn them off, and instead we clearly need to direct that into this source. So what we're keen to do is really sort of map out these opportunities and look at the barriers in the way and how the state can be a partner in unlocking some of those. So I think that is hugely exciting. I do have one question mark, which is sort of, I see hydrogen being proposed as a solution to so many fields. I think there is a question required between politicians and industry as to what the priorities for that would be. I think technology is moving so fast, however, there may be more options than we thought there would be, say, a year or 2 years ago. So yes, I think that's fundamentally a key part of it. I think to hit the current timescale on domestic vehicles, there's no doubt that batteries electrification is just a major part of that, and that's specifically the challenge that we can see in a lot of industry bodies, as you know, are doing work around that, hence that challenge is mapped out. But there are other things that are tremendously exciting. We've just got to make them consistent with other areas, for instance, in energy production, in domestic heating, a whole range of things, and that does require more coordination, I think, in terms of that overall industrial strategy from government.
Thank you. Jonathan's kindly agreed to stay for a couple of minutes afterwards. So if anyone's got questions they'd like to put to him personally, please do so. So as one of our headliners, this is, after all, the Automotive Glastonbury, but with better toilets. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.
Brilliant.
Jonathan
Thank you
Reynolds.
very much. Thank you.